Hello, welcome to Am I Neurodivergent, chapter 39 of 52. I'm Struan, late diagnosed ADHDer, so autism and ADHD, and these videos I'm doing are recapping my discovery year of realising I was neurodivergent after 40 odd years of having no idea. Disclaimer for this whole series, not an expert, don't speak for the whole neurodivergent community, just my own lived experience of getting a late diagnosis of autism and ADHD. So last week I looked at 25 strengths of being ADHD, which I wanted to put in as a good reminder that being ADHD can be just as awesome as it can be, and it can be challenging and frustrating. This week I want to stick with ADHD, but go right back and do a kind of mirror image of the very first couple of videos I did in this series, chapters 1 and 2, which I called Autism Lightbulb and Self-Test and Autism Self-Diagnosis What Now? And I wanted to do a kind of similar version of that again now, but with the broadly recognised Adult ADHD lightbulb moment self-test instead of the autism lightbulb. But also do that with some caveats. So in my own journey, my own discovery year, I was at this point 39 weeks, so roughly 9 months into my discovery year. I'd had my formal autism diagnosis for about 6 months and was coming to terms with that through therapy, various bits of therapy, and multiple therapists had told me that while they were confident the autism diagnosis I've received was correct, they also saw a lot of ADHD traits with me, and I'd passed pre-screening and been placed on a waiting list for a formal ADHD assessment as well at this point. And before I wind up this series, I'll go through what that formal ADHD assessment was like. But at this stage, I was just kind of back in limbo again, being kind of sure I was both autistic and ADHD, but not 100% sure yet. And I'm not going to do another imposter syndrome video specifically on ADHD. I did that about not being totally convinced you're autistic way back in chapter 7. But I think it really is worth capturing that as part of my journey and as part of my confusion getting to grips with all of this, that I had done the ADHD self-test way back about the same time I did the autism self-test I talked about back in chapter 1. And I scored low the first time I did the ADHD self-test, or at least not high enough to warrant a likely ADHD score. So how do I go from scoring low in an ADHD self-test to getting a formal diagnosis of not just ADHD, but severe ADHD just 1 year later? Did ADHD just pop up for me in the course of a year? Was I just stunningly unself-aware of my own challenges? And I think these are really interesting questions, both for me and potentially for others going through a bit of a similar neurodivergent discovery process themselves and trying to work out which neurodivergent sprinkles they may or may not have, and how nothing's really as straightforward or cut and dried as it might seem with all of this. It's increasingly looking like most neurodivergent conditions co-occur with other neurodivergent conditions that often mask or distort the way they present in any given individual, and as a result manifest differently to the way those conditions are captured and described in medical or diagnostic handbooks as individual standalone conditions, if that makes sense. So that big caveat aside, I want to kind of go back to first principles and talk through the ASRS v1.1, also known as the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale, which at least here in the UK is one of the most recognised ADHD self-tests, and the one I was asked to do when being screened to be put forward for a formal assessment. I try to put a link to both the standard ADHD and autism self-tests in the description to all of these videos, and I'll do the same in the description for this one. If people are curious and want to see how they score for ADHD in that standard self-test. There's also a ton of other online self-tests that are widely available. Some good and detailed, some less. So do a few if you're curious, is what I'd say, and get a good sense from taking a cross-section. Anyway, right, so I'm just going to do a quick run-through of the questions asked in the ASRS v1.1 for completeness. If I was better at this, I'd share my screen and talk through it, but I'm not, so I'm just going to look at it on my screen and talk through it. So, introductory blurb. It's a diagnostic tool designed to assess ADHD in adults. It was developed by the World Health Organization and Harvard Medical School. It's 18 questions divided up into two categories. First, inattention-based questions, and secondly, hyperactivity, impulsivity-based questions, which are the two main subtypes of ADHD. It's primarily used, in addition to being a useful self-test, for adults curious about their own possible ADHD by professional bodies as a screening tool before proceeding with formal assessments, and asks you to consider how you felt and conducted yourself over the previous 6 months, answering all the questions either never, rarely, sometimes, often, or very often. I'll just go through the questions first and then talk about some of the potential pitfalls of it after. So, Part A. Part A, the questions around inattentive ADHD. 1. How often do you have trouble wrapping up the final details of a project once the challenging parts have been done? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, never. 2. How often do you have difficulty getting things in order when you have to do a task that requires organisation? Never, rarely, sometimes, often, never. 3. How often do you have problems remembering appointments or obligations? Sometimes, often, blah, blah. 4. When you have a task that requires a lot of thought, how often do you avoid or delay getting started? 5. How often do you fidget or squirm with your hands or feet when you have to sit down for a long time? And 6. How often do you feel overly active and compelled to do things like you were driven by a motor? So, that's the standard inattentive ADHD-based screener questions. Part B, which is more focused around the impulsive hyperactive ADHD subtype, has 12 guide questions. Again, all of them answerable and scored as never, rarely, sometimes, often, never. So, question 7, how often do you make careless mistakes when you have to work on a boring or difficult project? 8. How often do you have difficulty keeping your attention when you're doing boring or repetitive work? 9. How often do you have difficulty concentrating on what people say to you, even when they are speaking to you directly? 10. How often do you misplace or have difficulty finding things at home or at work? 11. How often are you distracted by activity or noise around you? 12. How often do you leave your seat in meetings or other situations in which you are expected to remain seated? 13. How often do you feel restless or fidgety? 14. How often do you have difficulty unwinding and relaxing when you have time to yourself? 15. How often do you find yourself talking too much when you are in social situations? 16. When you're in a conversation, how often do you find yourself finishing the sentences of the people you are talking to before they can finish themselves? 17. How often do you have difficulty waiting your turn in situations when turn-taking is required? And 18. How often do you interrupt others when they are busy? So, yeah, that's the standard screening self-test. Do find the link in the description, click it, see how you come out. But the word of caution I really want to throw out there on this, and specifically from my own experience, is around AuDHD, around co-occurring autism and ADHD, which, as I've said a fair few times now, is increasingly looking to be way more common than previously realised. The word of caution, like I said, is that the first time I did this ADHD self-test, I scored below the threshold for both inattentive and hyperactive impulsive, and completely discounted ADHD for months for me. And because I'd scored high on the autism self-test, I just battled through trying to understand myself and my challenges through a purely autistic lens, and struggled with not quite having everything about that 100% chime with me. And it ended up being over a year later that I finally got not just diagnosed as having co-occurring ADHD alongside my autism, but having severe combined ADHD, which was ultimately concluded to be causing me way more problems in my everyday life than the autism itself I was initially diagnosed with was, which, looking back, really contributed to the autistic imposter syndrome I struggled with in the first 6 months of my diagnosis. I'd basically only been given part of my diagnosis at first, and it didn't completely fit, and that did really mess with me. The ADHD and the autism together, for me, as complicated and contradictory as it was, started to make so much more sense of everything at this point of the journey. So, how do you go from scoring low? Hang on, I've just said that, I'm repeating myself. How do you go from scoring low in an ADHD self-test to getting a formal diagnosis of severe combined ADHD is, basically what I was trying to pull together. So, this, like I said, this completely bewildered me for a bit, but the reason for that bewilderment was being AuDHD, was being both autistic and ADHD. The conditions clash and contradict, and I'm going to come back to this in more depth, probably next video or in a couple of videos, but one of the most common things about this, and this will be true for many late diagnosed neurodivergent individuals, you build up survival mechanisms, coping mechanisms, and because you've been undiagnosed all this time, you basically think you're doing fine and getting by okay, even if there's this sense of kind of impending dread sitting underneath pretty much everything you do. And those coping mechanisms and survival mechanisms are basically paper thin. And this is why late adult neurodivergent diagnoses so often come after a mental breakdown or stress breakdown or severe burnout, when all of those coping and survival mechanisms basically hit their limit and splinter and fall apart a bit. And of course, you don't have to be AuDHD to have developed all these coping and survival mechanisms. Pure ADHDers have no doubt done it too and are managing to just about hang on to life. But from personal experience with AuDHD, this is definitely true. For example, I was answering the self-test like, no, I never have problems remembering appointments or obligations, because I learned over many years to live my life off a complex and time-consuming system of master spreadsheet, plus many phone reminders specifically to avoid me missing appointments and obligations and always running late and hating myself for it, which I always did when I was younger. I was a shit show, but developed a system around that kind of worked for me, but was absolutely exhausting. I was also answering the self-test, no, I'm never restless or fidgety, because over many years I've trained myself not to squirm and get up and move around, because it makes you stand out. And the one thing you don't want to do, or I didn't want to do when you feel really different to everyone else anyway, is stand out more. So ADHD masking is just as much of a thing as autistic masking, which I've talked about and done a video on. It's just when you're both ADHD and autistic, you're masking essentially every aspect of yourself. and basically training yourself to be as numb and bland and inauthentic as possible, which obviously ends up being extremely bad for you. Hence burnout and breakdown for so many people again and again and again. But for so many of us, we just don't know we're struggling with something that has a name and is really fucking common. It's just ADHD. So to counterbalance the formal test a little I've just been through, if you're still watching or listening at this point, I'm also going to tag and run through an online article that really chimed with me as I was going through this part of the journey of it dawning on me that I was both autistic and ADHD. It's a great article from Attitude magazine called OMG, So That's Why I Do That, which I read and which had some pretty profoundly recognizable behaviors and traits and feelings in it. Again, I'll post a link to that article in the description if people want to check it out, because I think it works really well as a kind of complement to the self-test in terms of slightly less clinical areas of recognition and navigating, wondering whether ADHD is or isn't a particular neurodivergent pizza topping for you. So I'm basically just going to crib and run through their 12 typical ADHD behaviors with my own thoughts kind of sprinkled in as things to consider around whether you might be ADHD or not if you're navigating this stretch of water too. Behavior number 1. Most people with ADHD have always known that they are, or felt that they are, a bit different, or been told by others that they don't quite fit the mold, that they should try harder to be like everyone else. But we can't, because amongst other things, behavior number 2, and this is a major one, and it's really hard for non-ADHDers to grasp, the ADHD inner world is not linear. Past, present, and future are not really separate and distinct the way they are for neurotypicals. For better or worse, and it can be both, everything is now for ADHDers, and it's really hard for us to both learn from the past or look into the future to see the consequences of our actions. And the manifestation of it is often pathologized as impulsivity, but in layman's terms, it's just really, really difficult for ADHDers to learn from experience and predict consequences. We often really want to try stuff, but don't massively think it through. Behavior 3, planning and sequencing events, work, and activities. Tasks for neurotypicals have a beginning, middle, and end. For ADHDers, because of impatience and impulsivity, we tend to jump straight into the middle of a task and then go in all directions at once from there. Or we can't find the beginning, so we don't know where to start, and then procrastinate over it in a horrible spiraling shame cycle. And organization systems work on a linear model, so almost every system of task organization intuitively doesn't work for us either. Like, we try them, but unless we're autistic too, in which case we won't stop until we find one, even if it kills us. Hopefully, just metaphorically. Behavior 4, nervous system overwhelm. ADHDers, as a rule, experience life more intensely than neurotypicals, right? We want and need to be engaged in interesting and challenging things, so constantly occupy ourselves with too many things, more things than we can reasonably deal with. So nothing truly gets done well because we end up with too many plates spinning. Behavior 5, sensory overwhelm, the familiar that I've talked about before, everything everywhere all at once effect, a very common overlap with autism spectrum condition as well. Our senses are often battered by strong sounds, brightness, smells, and sensory input that neurotypicals are just largely oblivious to, or notice but just don't get battered by as much. Behaviour 6, challenge 6, we need adrenaline to get things done. ADHDers are masters at meeting last minute deadlines. We're great in a crisis, but complete shit shows when things become boring and routine again, because we need the adrenaline produced by stress to make up for the dopamine deficiency around motivation that's common in ADHD. If something ain't urgent, it ain't getting done. Behaviour 7, inconsistency. Undiagnosed ADHDers likely feel immensely frustrated with themselves because some of the time when we're interested in something, we'll be crazy motivated, interested, and highly productive. And in other times, we cannot engage, start, or sustain a project, even when we know we need to, and others are depending on us, because it's not interesting to us and doesn't motivate us. We start to see ourselves as unreliable and undependable and feel deeply ashamed of ourselves for being this way. But we're just ADHD. We just need to find our reward system by working on things that interest us and delegating the things that don't. Easier said than done, but fundamentally that's the magic ticket for unlocking our potential and getting ourselves unstuck. Behaviour 8, challenge 8, brains in perpetual motion. Undiagnosed ADHDers learn to hide our physical hyperactivity, but our mental hyperactivity never shuts off, and it is exhausting. Our brains go at 100 miles per hour and can make it really challenging to listen to other people or relax enough to fall asleep at regular hours. We can't stop, basically. Behaviour 9, challenge 9, brains that are disorganised. ADHDers are often incredibly smart, but our minds are like vast libraries that lack a system of organisation and often just have snippets of useful information gleaned from books, the internet, podcasts, magazines, without any surrounding context linking them all together in a logical way. The way we store, process, and link information often makes perfect sense to us, but very few others. Behaviour 10, forgetfulness. If information and memories aren't at the top of our minds, they go. It's all in there, but without a logical system of recall, can get lost, the same way keys and phones and important documents often get lost. It's often referred to as working memory, a working memory deficit. For example, I've used this example before. You can write a great report, but get asked to verbally summarise what you wrote, even relatively recently, and you'll just kind of fishmouth, because it's not the most recent thing you thought about. So the immediate recall of and access to it has dropped. So cue massive self-frustration and probably feeling way dumber than you actually are as a result. You're not dumb. It's just ADHD. 11, behaviour 11, self-awareness. ADHDers are often quite empathetic and can read others quite well, but can have very poor self-awareness around how we ourselves are doing moment to moment, which can lead us to getting things wrong socially, failing to read the room, or coming across as over-talkative or even narcissistic. We then get negative feedback about how we've acted or behaved and spiral off into another shame cycle for having got it wrong yet again. Again, just ADHD. Behaviour 12, challenge 12, time awareness. Closely related to task sequencing, but everything happens right now or not at all. for ADHDers, there's often very little reliable sense of time and how to manage it for us as ADHDers. Time is kind of elastic in ADHD brains based on whether we're interested or not interested in what we're doing, and we never quite get the hang of using time consistently the way neurotypicals do, which is why we're often late for things, and stress that people are stressed with us for not managing ourselves or managing our time well. Our brains just don't operate the same as non-ADHD brains. So anyway, yeah, these 12 behaviours or 12 challenges are hopefully a useful add-on to the more formal questions asked in the Adult ADHD Self Test to at least give pause for thought on whether you think you've got ADHD or not, or whether there's enough going on that you may have ADHD going on alongside another neurodivergent condition. Yep, as ever, thanks for watching. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, sign up for alerts, love yourself, cherish your inner child, solve the climate crisis, bring peace to the Middle East, and I don't know, stay hydrated and get a good night's sleep. None of us suck, and we're all awesome in ways that are completely unique to us as individuals. Cheers. Bye.